Good day, I welcome everyone who has joined us today. My name is Olga Tamanova. I am happy to welcome you in the Media Center Ukraine, Ukrinform today. We've invited you today to discuss a very interesting topic today. We'll be discussing today the outcomes of the Global Peace Summit, conclusions and results, which took place on the 15th, 16th June in Switzerland. So today we will be speaking about it with our speakers. I would like to introduce the participants, our guests today. We have Yevhen Magda, Executive Director of the Institute of World Policy. We have Natalya Plaksienko-Butyrska, expert on East Asia, Master of International Relations, and Vadym Denysenko, political scientist, and Volodymyr Horbach, Executive Director of Institute for Northern Eurasia Transformation. Hello, friends. So let us start with the conclusions. What conclusions can we make today according to the results of the Global Summit of Peace? We saw many opinions, many expert conclusions according to its results. So which most important conclusions have you made? Yevhen, let's start with you. Good day, thank you. The main conclusion is, in fact, in 8 letters. To be continued. So I think that we can see in the mode of real time how the search is going on of any way to peace. And for me, it's important that Ukraine, in this case, is playing a role of an initiator. The fact that the 10 peace formula points were made public and the meeting took place, and between them a year and a half passed, it witnesses that this process was rather complicated. It tells us that it looks like the puzzle, where we had tens of different components, and that we have this puzzle is already a success. However, Russia and unfortunately China were playing against the participation in the summit and against the representation at the high level. That was obvious. Still, I think that for Ukraine, the summit is witnessing that the war for us is still for a long time, as at this summit, the representatives of different clubs, if I may say so, a club of the West, a club of the Global South, they all were in their own repertoire. None of them have changed their position during the process, and it is also very demonstrative. As well as Saudi Arabia, which during 3 weeks before the summit was twice visited by the president, it still did not sign a communiqué. By the way, I wouldn't like to take Bürgenstock communiqué and transform it into the similar thing of Budapest Memorandum. It will be our big mistake. We shouldn't do that. It's just a document which witnessed the positions of the participants of this meeting. And 3 points of them are humanistic, they are understandable, they have the right for existence, and in fact it is hard to contradict them. I think that we can think about how and when the second summit takes place. However, it is not understandable for me why we should be in a hurry. I don't understand it technologically. I understand that we all would like the war to be over as soon as possible. But it has to be over under the Ukrainian conditions. And such optimistic statements that Russia will take part in the second summit, so far I don't understand what they base upon. Moreover, if we take into consideration that before the summit in Bürgenstock on the 14th of June, there was the individual summit of Putin with Putin in Moscow. So pay attention. It was a kind of demonstrative, two-component speech. On the one hand, the speech in the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, which was taken for quotes by anyone. And on the other hand, there was the meeting with the so-called Special Military Operation Heroes. They have a program, A Time of Heroes. And Putin did not only highlight his participation in this show, but also he said that in the military actions and combats, approximately 700,000 people take part from Russia. That is about the scale. So then we have the question, is it the military special operation? Even if by mathematical calculations, there should be the similarity. In the military actions and combats, more than 1 million people are taking place. What is on earth is that operation? And I think that it's important that Putin, in fact, would cosplay Adolf Hitler in Munich of 1938, when they cut Sudets from Czechoslovakia. But then it was blackmail by the war, and now it was during the 28th month of the full-scale invasion. Just feel the difference. That is why I think that there are three active components which we have to work with. First is the strengthening of our internal capacity to resist through optimization of the work of the state institutions, through the systematic approach and solving the problems and mistakes which occur. Secondly, activation of Ukrainian diplomacy. I think it's obvious because as for the African map, you can see that there are some things to do there. And thirdly, the understanding that intermediary role in the end of Russo-Ukrainian war by several actors is perceived as they can get political and economic dividends by that. That is why I think that Ukraine has to operate the fact and use the perspective of preferences in the access to the process of the restoration of Ukrainian economy, Ukrainian infrastructure, to those who are closer to us at a certain positions. The war is not just combats, it's not only diplomacy, it's also economic interests. Thank you. Volodymyr, I would like to hear your opinion about the outcomes of this summit. Do you agree with Yevhen that, in fact, according to the conclusions, everybody confirmed his or her position and did not change it? Because we saw some people were back, somebody joined later. Yes, thank you. Thank you. Good day. Yes, in fact, that's an interesting situation with the conclusions, because even the top management of Ukraine said instantly that this final communique will be joined by other participants and countries, even the ones which did not take part in the conference. And in fact, it reminds us a petition campaign, global signature raising under some petition. What's the point of this petition about success? Was this event successful? What's the sense of this petition? The text itself did not mention it, but it was in the context. Because mostly at large in the agenda, which could be hidden, maybe not hidden, but still as the subtext of all of the discussions was the request for peace. By the way, what we name and we say the Global Peace Summit, at the summit itself, The name was, the Swiss side named it Peace Summit in Ukraine, without the word global, though there was a request, a global request shaped for the peace in Ukraine. They named it, but the only way out, or just the way which we could hear, is the dialogue with Russia. How to achieve peace? Through the dialogue. And the fact that for more than 2 years it is impossible, and there are no signs that something has changed, still the agenda of this discussion has been formed with this subtext, expectations, whether Ukraine will have this so-called second summit, a meeting with the participation of Russia, and will Ukraine agree to invite Russian Federation? And Ukraine decided to satisfy this request at the official level. The president and the head of the office said for multiple times that they assume the possible participation. It was mentioned as already the acknowledgement. Yes, we are ready for that. To sit with the representative of Russian Federation at the same table in the round table for communication and negotiations with others. And it wouldn't be just a bilateral thing, it would be an international conference. The main key conclusion which this summit led to, the Swiss conference led to, it opened the windows for further movement to the talks, to the negotiations with Russian Federation. Still, Russian Federation recently closed the doors for these negotiations and confirmed again that diplomatic or any other negotiations, regulation of this war, settlement of this war is impossible, because it's impossible to find points of touch or any of the intersections and compromise. Those are mutually contradictory interests which cannot be coordinated between Russia and Ukraine, or I would say Russian regime. So, the conclusion as something stable cannot be seen. We may say that it was the beginning of some different, longer process without any hopes or expectations for the successful continuation or finalization. In my opinion, my forecast is that the pause will be going on for some time, at least until the US elections of the president. All of the sides will be looking at each other and nod into each other's direction and go on with combats at the front lines and at the rear. That is a sad and bad conclusion. But if we look further on, this concept of peace, the request for peace, which was shaped, by the way, by the Chinese position as well, China, in fact, has formed this subtext of negotiations when they said that we will not sit at the table without Russia. And this is what was discussed during the discussion. Definitely, the Western countries have supported us, but Global South dodged the right and proper direct answer. We need to state that, and let me add, maybe that was the wrong objective by Ukraine to take Global South to our side. We found out it's just impossible because of the contradictions in the interests and because Ukraine is not part of Global South and does not claim to be one. It is the part of Global West, and it is acknowledged by even our adversaries and opponents when they are at war with us, with the same fact of the war. But so far it is not finally acknowledged by the Global West. However, the progress is significant, and the context, if we look at it, the summit of G7 in Italy, before the Swiss meeting, was forming the situation much stronger, and this event was much more significant than Bürgenstock conference, because they spoke about the global issues, really global ones, of the forces distribution. So it, in fact, through the secondary sanctions against Chinese and Turkish private companies, it created the beginning of the movement towards the formation of two bigger world blocs, which won't be just competing with each other, but will also be in the confrontation. This is the context where we have and had the Swiss conference, and we go on with our Russo-Ukrainian war. Natalia, I would like to take Global South as a separate question. Let us discuss that in more details later. Now about the efficiency of the summit. What's your vision? Well, in fact, as it was mentioned by the previous speakers, it's just the beginning. So speaking about any of the outcomes would be totally impossible. And even the organizers, the Ukrainian authorities, who went through this long way and obviously started with one expectation, but considering different events which have changed at the front line and in the international political community, they did not appoint any ambitious objective to achieve certain outcomes. And we can see that even because out of the 10 points for the discussion, they brought only 3 of them, and the main objective was to collect as many participants as possible, and it was a kind of a quantitative objective for support. But from my perspective, for Ukraine, during the future preparation of summits, it is important not to lose the main objective. The main objective is peace, fair peace, which is acceptable for Ukraine under the Ukrainian conditions. Because on the way to achieve this peace, and how these negotiations are joined by other countries which are trying to find consensus, we find other proposals, and we can see how separate the opinions of other countries were. If we take the Western part and the part of so-called Global South, and maybe even among the Western countries as well, there is the request of peace everywhere, but what kind of peace? And unfortunately, among many of them, we can hear the peace at the expense of concessions. We will, in fact, face this proposal, whether we have the peace with concessions, or it will be fair, but not that soon. And it will not depend on the summit, but on the position of Ukraine at the front line, on whether we have the pressure on Russia, in particular by the secondary sanctions, support of other countries, including China, and how comprehensive will be support of Ukraine, and whether the West understands, or whether it is ready to live, understanding that the war in Ukraine is not a local one, is not just European one, and Russia multiplies different local conflicts all over the world, which can be visible or not that visible. So the response and support of Ukraine should be created to prevent the wider dissemination of the problems in the world at the global level. Thank you. Vadym, the main conclusions from you. Well, it's hard to add anything here. The only thing which I would add, I would speak about Putin's statement, which the colleague said it was the summit for himself, mono summit. So, in fact, we need to understand specifically what Putin said. Putin de facto cut any ways to retrieve to himself and his surrounding. He said that with his statement, in fact, he provided the ultimatum for everybody and for himself first and foremost, that he doesn't have anywhere to retreat and he's going on to do whatever he is doing. So we should think why this ultimatum was done for himself. Why did he make this statement? Because seems nothing was bad for him. From my opinion, it should be the global view on the what Yevhen said, what will be later on, what is to be continued. Because Putin is really afraid that if China is included into the negotiations process, Putin will be forced to make certain concessions. Because the situation in Russian economy, we can now say that the trade in fact, balance between Russia and China, in spite of the record level, we can see that it is very close to zero. So it is in the positive zone, but in fact it is close to zero. And according to the outcomes of 2024, with a high possibility, we may say that the trade balance between Russia and China will be, if not zero, it will be minus for Russia. It is just one of the examples that the situation in the economy of Russia is not that joyful as Putin likes to explain. And he tells that after the changes of Belousov and rotation of Belousov and his replacement, because something had to be done with the corrupt flows, which are not enough for anyone. So, in fact, if we say who is the main recipient of this Putin's ultimatum, obviously that was Xi Jinping and the Chinese People's Republic, which in fact was told that you can press on us, but Russia is not ready to retreat. And all of that is taking place with little concessions in Russian-Chinese relations. In particular, the latest one, which we almost did not notice, that Russia gave part of its territory, giving direct access to the river, which is called Tumannaya in Russian transcription. That is the river which is the border between North Korea and Russia. And de facto, China got direct access to the Japanese Sea, Sea of Japan. So these are the consequences of the summit, which my colleagues did not mention. Vadym, what about the perspective of the participation of Russia in the next summit? What would you say? On the one hand, the ultimatum of Putin for Ukrainian understanding is impossible. The negotiations and talks that we give away the territories which are not even occupied seems for us a kind of the story we cannot even imagine how it can be implemented. So what is the perspective? Because at the next round, Russia can be joining these negotiations. Well, and first of all, we need to speak about the time limits. The probability that it happens before the US elections exists, but it's minimal. It is totally minimal. As for what happens formally in 9 to 12 months, it is hard to imagine that. Of course, if Putin still has this position, the current position, and China does not pressure, and they have some leverage, maybe not that global, but still they have this leverage onto Russia. If we have certain negotiations between China and the US, then in fact, theoretically, we can speak about some hypothetical opportunities that Putin or his representatives can appear at some negotiations or quasi-negotiations at some formats which can hardly be named negotiations. But still, considering the current reality, it looks like a science fiction story. And we shouldn't forget that for Putin, it is incredibly important to play his role in the game and to try to play the story when he forces the West for the negotiations, bargaining his relations with China, and the statement that he, as if, can cut the North Korea from the impact of China or Central Asia or somebody else. His visits to North Korea and his attempts internationally are targeted for that. He would fail because he doesn't have financial resources for that. However, he will make such attempts. So honestly speaking, I wouldn't speak whether Russia would be present or not at the next negotiations in a year. As of now, we don't have the answer anywhere, starting with Putin himself. If anybody has any other opinion about that, please, or maybe a different opinion? No, you do not. Perfect. Nice unity of opinions. Now I'd like us to speak about the Global South track, which we name it mostly like that. The countries which belong to it don't like it, in fact, but still. There were several opinions among our experts, and one of those opinions was close to Volodymyr's opinion, whether we need to spend so much efforts to this track, considering the outcome which we can get. Another opinion was that, on the opposite, we need to spend more efforts on it, because it's one of the requirements of the United States as well, and other partner countries. What are your opinions about that? Natalia, please. I was actively observing the West, considering that it is my sphere of interest, and China, and the East. And sometimes it seemed to me that too much of resource was spent for China, considering that it was not going to help and is not going to help Ukraine, and it has its own game. Still, I can see that now, for instance, Ukraine is not losing contacts, at least attempts to get in touch with China, and obviously, maybe at some level, we have certain hopes, or maybe even understanding that we'll have to involve China under certain conditions. And unfortunately, that long story with the support by the US and their electoral processes, and some of the statements by Trump, they witness that at some moment Russia may not have enough of support by the West to keep their positions. And obviously that is why China is still in the view, though it's obvious that China is trying now, and we heard it already, to shape the second pole and use the events which were around the war, and that Russia and China managed to raise anti-West deals in certain countries. That was also the war of Hamas against Israel as one of the factors, because those were the points which they used. So as of today, on the one hand, yes, we were forced to adjust to that. And as I said, our peace depends on the sustainability of the army and the help of the West and our internal sustainability, first of all. But overall, in the overall perspective, we understood that we need to work more with different regions. And these are the strategic moves for the further development, for the further relations. But on the other hand, it has to become a signal for the Western countries that they have lost, unfortunately, not only their influence and authority, they gave the opportunity to Russia and China to play on some anti-Western sentiments in many countries. And as of today, it leads to substantial global separation. We are the country which is unfortunately in the middle of this separation. That is why we feel it that well in this split. But the consequences can be really substantial if we don't begin to work together on these relations, in particular by the West. Yevhen, the floor is yours. The advantage of the expert discussion is that, listening to the opinions of my colleagues, you're activating your own thinking process. So, a couple of maybe not even remarks, but observations of mine. First of all, we need to understand precisely that China, considering that at the official level it represents a different societal political formation than the Western world does, it cannot just be at the same level with the Western countries. As they say, when everybody is united for the sake of peace in Ukraine, it is impossible. And for me, it seems that communist ideology has been used for the well-prepared soil of the society of Confucius. But I'm speaking about a totally different thing. We will not solve the issue of relations with China during short term, though the visit of Andriy Sabiga to China looks to me a very demonstrative gesture that Ukraine is giving its hand and is saying that we are ready for the dialogue with you. And the dialogue, which shouldn't rely upon the fight between capitalism and socialism, but also cooperation, and that we could finalize the war as quickly as possible. There are several factors which we need to pay attention to. I was already speaking about our internal strengthening, our capacity to resist, because we do not know how long the war is going to be. And the point that the war is go on for 2 or 3 weeks has lost its relevance already. So we have, speaking about the information in Ukrinform about that, I need to emphasize we need to create this image of the light in the end of the tunnel. How long this tunnel may seem to us. And on the one hand, it's a complicated process, but it is necessary, because otherwise, in the end of the war, we'll face with the complex of issues which will be incredibly hard for us. The second point is that our internal issues, how they are extrapolated onto the West, for instance. We have to specifically remind ourselves that as of today, the substantial part of Ukrainian budget is being funded by our partners, and that is why corruption in Ukraine, and recently we had a kind of information wave, which tells that separate state officials, I have an impression they lost their instinct of self-preservation. Totally. The person seems to be speaking about the light in the end of the tunnel. The person is getting towards the railway train and is not going to leave. So the issue is that this money, which is coming to us, this is the state budgets of our partners. And in the US, they'll have the elections and have a very tense electoral campaign. With a high probability, Trump will be saying that in Ukraine they steal the money of American taxpayers. And for us, it will be a serious issue because we have a tendency to make it obvious. I don't know whether we can hear that in the UK. Maybe we can hear that in France. But the probability is rather high, because this is the topic which can be easily understood. The topic of your own wallet is close to any person. And another topic is the topic of our contacts with the South. Well, we can assume not just 3 points, but 2.5 points, because Black Sea shipping is deblocked. And Ukraine, in fact, has restored the export of grain. So in this sense, Ukraine is just obliged now to take this and to sell it in the information way, because we are also solving the Chinese issues by this way, because the stability of African countries, thanks to the delivery of Ukrainian grain, will be strengthened, not just permanently having some turbulence. So for us, this summit is the starting platform so as we could instantly see that as a game at several geopolitical chessboards. If we play with white or black figures, but first of all, we need to play with yellow and blue ones. Thank you, Volodymyr and Vadym. The question is to you. Maybe you have to add anything on the topic of Global South. Do we need to spend our efforts in that, and how much? What do you think? So, in fact, let me say the following. Ukraine has spent, for the work with Global South, lots of resources. More than a year and a half of work with the organization of this event. These are resources of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, first and foremost. And if the presidential office was dealing directly with the Ukrainian-American relations, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs with Ukrainian-African, Ukrainian-South American ones, and recently with Asian as well, and even the Chinese ones. Because Yevhen was speaking about the visit of the Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs to China. That is true as well. But whether those efforts were worth it, and the spending of these resources was worth it, it's a philosophical issue. We don't know what would happen if we did not do that. I would say it's an expert issue. Yes, but it's important to make conclusions of what we got. The outcome is the configuration of forces in the world. All of that is not taking place in the vacuum. That is in the context of what I'm speaking about, the confrontation between China and the US. And even the recent tendency between China and the EU in trade, and also the machines, cars and vehicles at the Chinese market. This is the beginning of the process. So in this context, we could see that China and Russian Federation can impact the countries of global South and to prohibit them to take part in this process, or to force them not to sign the final communique, or in certain cases even to force them withdraw their signature, which was already made. So the confrontation between the East and the West, or maybe the New East and the Old West, is there already. And we can see it already out of what has taken place with the signatures and the participants. It's not just the argument, it's the proof of this confrontation. It's its reflection. And I would say that it will gain different, stronger, and even signs of these countering. In this case, we are in the situation that we need the voices and votes of Global South, but we understand that those votes are more looking at Moscow and Beijing than Washington, Brussels, or moreover Kyiv. And in this situation, I think it would be important to concentrate our efforts on the Western side, on those regions of the world and states, the countries, which really can and want to help us in our grief, in our situation. Not the ones who we failed to bring back to us. When we are speaking about the Global South, the overall picture, well, that is the very highbrow notion, Global South. We don't have Global North now, right? Russian Federation is out of the context, so we don't have Global North. Still, we have it the South and West. Honestly speaking, I lost my idea already. I lost the thread of the thought. So coming back to the South, in the configuration, I was speaking about the group of seven, the G7, the leaders of the collective global West. We have G20, formally speaking all of them, West and East together. But we also have such a format as BRICS, which is plus because it's expanded as well. This is the Global South without the West. That is what excludes G7, in fact. And all of those participants of BRICS were in fact, abstaining, because the same happened with India, China, Brazil, South Africa. What are they waiting? Why did they do that? They are waiting for the end of the war, to be on the side of the strongest, the winner. They don't want to risk and to fight on their own. They don't see their interest in support of Ukraine. They are waiting whether the collective efforts of Russia and China, which is in fact with it in economic side, whether they manage to exhaust the resource potential of the West in the Russo-Ukrainian war, and to use this situation either economically or geopolitically, and each of the BRICS countries is the regional leader. They are associating themselves with Russia, which claims for exceptional interests in the neighborhood. This is how they associate themselves, maybe even subconsciously, with Russia and the opportunities which may be open after the end of the world order to dominate in their own region is the option which would open for them after Russian victory. They will never name that out loud. I am the only one who can afford myself. But they are ending how the Russian war ends. If we look at the future negotiations, peace negotiations, and the peace formula as a certain equation, we just need to give an answer whether it is possible to solve this equation without China. If we think that we can solve this issue without China, then we do not need to pay attention to Global South. If we think that it's impossible, then we understand that under any circumstances we need to pay as much attention as possible to China, and it would be better more countries of Global South. I think that solving this equation without China would be incredibly hard. And Volodymyr said about the last year and a half, unfortunately, since 2014, we didn't have any relations with China. De facto, during the last 10 years, we didn't have it. In fact, we didn't have Chinese policy in Ukraine as it is. We can name lots of examples why it happened like that and explain that. But let's take it as a fact. And what happened with the Commission and the first deputy of the Minister of Foreign Affairs, which was rather efficient in China, that is a big advantage. But let me repeat, the key issue is the issue on how we see the peace formula. If we understand that it is possible without China and China will be only the fifth wheel, then maybe we should just move properly into the Western direction, knowing that in the perspective of one generation, the world will be bisected at least into two global centers, the Western and the Chinese, and Russia will try to create its own center, though I think it will fail. And the second approach is, in fact, if we understand that it would be impossible to solve this equation, this task, not even the existential issue, but the current issue of this war without China, then we need to work with China and to think how to solve the issue of war and to create relations with the West and Global South. Thank you, dear colleagues and friends. If you've got any comments or questions, please join our conversation. Just let me know about that. And looking at the first part of our conversation, you came to the common conclusion that after the global summit, we are at the state to be continued. Let's see what happens then. And to have the efficient way on, we need to make our own home assignment. So what should it be so as we could finally achieve some efficient solution of this great and long process? What should it be? What should we do at least till the next step, the next round of such negotiations or summits? That's a global question. I can write several theses about that. Look, I will localize my answer because what's painful for me should be the topic of my speech. So if we have now the current situation which was described for the previous 40 minutes, there is the global issue that Ukraine does not have a single center which would deal with the Russian studies, but also Ukraine doesn't have a single center, at least besides except several experts who would deal with Global South. I'm not speaking about any of the local issues, like studying what is taking place in Vietnam, where Putin went to today. We have some of the experts, but we lack the understanding. We don't have the global institutions which would deal with that. And it is really important for us to strengthen our competency in that. So you mean that we don't even have basic things? Yes, how can we provide the diagnosis if we don't have the tools for diagnosis? Natalya, please. According to my idea, first of all, we need to support and preserve internal unity. That's important. That's what gives us strength, because this is the long-term game. And we came to this acknowledgement that no one will fight for us. They can help us. They can support us. They can interfere or be our obstacles. To some extent, we understood that at this summit as well. So we need social unity, cohesion, and understanding of the responsibility of every single person at his or her place, what he or she is doing for the sake of the victory for this fight. The fight with the information impact, because recently a very bright and noticeable thing is that we had a very nice start, but recently we cannot be compliant and respond the Russian use of these factors, in particular at the international level. We spoke about the reforms and the fight against corruption. That is a very important factor, because together with this war we get through the internal transformation, which leads us to the EU accession, which leads us and will lead us to the NATO accession, and which will help Ukraine create, under favorable conditions, a very nice and attractive country. Those are the factors. As for the summit, it's obvious that the authorities, the ones who were dealing with that work, they got certain conclusions, what they need to make, and to work on that. Because when the summit, I already said that when the summit and the peace formula was presented by the president, we had totally different conditions. So this preparation has to get through the transformation according to the conditions, according to who we can rely upon, who we can't. So we are in the process, and it is hard. This process is a bit too long. It inflicts pressure on each of us. We were speaking about the light in the end of the tunnel, so each of us has to understand what we are striving for and what we personally can do about that. I'd like to support my colleague in the words she was totally right to repeat, that our strength is in our unity, internally. First of all, we need to have the stake on the national strength and unity and cohesion. In this context, I'd like to drive attention to the unnoticed initiative of the previous president, Poroshenko, who said that the further discussions and negotiations on this peace summit in Ukraine and Switzerland could go on at the General Assembly of the UN, which will be open in September this year. It will also be the format of work with the Global South. Almost all of the delegations will be there, the absolute majority of the world countries, and at this platform will be able to provide those negotiations, dialogues, and discussions with the same useful ratio as we could see in Bürgenstock last week. And we shouldn't, of course, see such situations when the opposition politicians are not allowed to go abroad to the international meetings. This is the sign of weakness, and our opponents and enemies are using that. What will happen after that? That the official representatives of Ukraine at the conference and President Zelensky, first and foremost, should speak about just peace. This is the just red line, I would say. Unfair peace would not be perceived in Ukraine. And the unfair peace will not just survive. And this is the red line which we need to speak about firmly. So, in fact, it would mean that there will be a certain pause, a break. Ukraine gave the signal that it is ready for the peace at the fair conditions, under fair conditions, and even ready to hypothetically speak with the Russian representatives at the next summit. Ukraine shows its goodwill, because the global expectations is that Ukraine should have some peace settlement. We are compliant with these global expectations, including the internal Ukrainian ones. But Russia is closing the door to this way. It creates the situation of pause and is waiting. So let me repeat, we still need to stay at our position and specifically mention and broadcast, first of all, goodwill. That is good in this case, and we should understand that we need to have an opportunity to stop at the red line of fair peace and not to have any concessions after that. We need to document that and let our Western partners understand that, as well as any other partners. And first of all, our enemies have to understand that. Yevhen? Well, just when we are speaking about the preparatory measures, first of all, we need to work with a long-term perspective. This is the obvious reality, because in the modern world, the ones who do not create any long-term strategies with tactical actions will lose. Secondly, how many citizens understand what peace plan of Volodymyr Zelensky is and what 10 points are? If we don't focus on that, if it is not the idea which is comprehensible by our citizens, then any fair and just peace can be considered to be unjust. This is the technologically implemented. Volodymyr has mentioned about the Poroshenko's initiative. It has a very simple explanation. In 2022 and 2023, the General Assembly of UN acknowledged the resolution, adopted the resolution for the support of territorial integrity of Ukraine. As of today, this is the most important moment for us to restore the borders as of 1991, though this process is rather hard. So in certain figures, I would say it was more than just signees of communique in Bürgenstock for dozens of points. So we shouldn't focus on certain efforts. It would be just enough to understand the timing of the obvious timing of the session of the UN General Assembly. Yes, obviously it will take place before the US elections, and next week we will see, I would say, the first approximate debates between Biden and Trump, and we'll hear how they will mention Ukraine. That is important for us as well. I think that whatever it may sound weird considering the international perspective, but without the strengthening of our internal capacities, we can get into the weaker position that we would like to be. Thank you. We have a question, please. Hello, Detector Media. Thank you for the interesting discussion. I would like to agree with Vadym about the expertise, because if we are speaking about China and about African countries and Latin America, it's obvious that Ukraine doesn't have so many experts who would study that in a systematic manner. So I have such an impression that now at the West, they still do not understand that you need to formulate kind of one idea, one narrative. Many people speak about many strategic narratives. It was one of the topics of Riga dialogues of strategic communications, where I took part in the beginning of June. And Ukraine and West are in the situation when we want higher involvement of the global South, though we don't like this notion. And Ukraine uses this notion much more than any academics which study colonialism, but still. What is that narrative, according to your opinion, that Ukraine and the West should formulate a separate narrative for separate regions like Africa, the Pacific, the Middle East? Who is ready for that? In fact, Yegor, you said that the global South, this notion emerged by Russia. because it is being used and exploited during the Russian aggression against Ukraine, during the period when Russia was seeking to create the split using the Soviet legacy, and they succeed in that. We cannot have one and only narrative, unfortunately, even for the region, if we look at that. Considering that, well, let us take Asia, which I am dealing with. Even in its borders, it is so diverse in its regions and in its religious component. It is so diverse. So I'm trying to follow our diplomacy, our advocacy visits to the countries of Asia, and in each case I have to face totally different conditions, and I have to find totally different wordings for that. And let us look, this is the specifics and this is the issue that we haven't dealt with. We did not drive attention to these countries. We were not studying them enough. As for Vietnam and the visit of Putin to Vietnam, I commented this visit for several times already. Vietnam is a kind of a very demonstrative example about many Asian countries. Because of their colonial past, because of the wars, they chose the policy of balancing between bigger forces, which gave them the opportunity to survive and get some profit. The same is about Vietnam, which is actively uniting, combining interaction with Russia, with their traditional relations and Soviet legacy, and also they had certain relations in the energy sphere, in the sphere of weapons sales by Russia when it used to be Soviet Union, and they strengthened the relations with the US as well. And many Vietnamese internally still have many restrictions because of the memory about that war. The economic component, the economic attractiveness, and the opportunity of the United States to provide security support in the countering, well, maybe not even countering, but unequal relations with China gives the opportunity to interact with this country. And with China, it is totally demonstrative case when, for instance, in the Asian region, there were lots of countries which are very cautious about China. Maybe they even have negative attitude, but they cooperate and have trade relations fighting for certain territories. So this is the whole Asia. And when we are coming to each of the countries, we need to understand and start with the very beginning that their interest should be prevailing. And we need to show this value added. Recently, I was speaking a lot that Ukraine is, for a long time, in its search of itself, was forgetting to broadcast its own values. And only when the war started, many of us was revealing the value of our own country, our own cities, and we started to compare ourselves with the attractive countries which we considered to be perfect. That is why our own values, the importance of them, considering that we are getting through a very substantial fight, and this is the fight not only for our existence, this is also the international order, liberal values. So first and foremost, our understanding of what we can give, what we can bring, whether we can be useful. When we look at this list, for each of the countries will have some use. And this is a kind of an applied use. The development of our military equipment, our fight in the experience in the fight with Russia. Many people mentioned our grain. Turns out that we were feeding the world and influencing the pricing. Our IT experts. And we will find the whole list which totally coincides with the palette of the whole world, and it can be the advantage. This is what we need to bring to every country. I'll try to be really short. So as for one and only narrative, it is extremely hard, especially having not only the restricted but really scarce resources which Ukraine now has. Answering your question, let me say about two important points. First and key one is that, unfortunately, the collective West refused to have information war against Russian Federation. One of the most important points which we have to speak about louder, it's about communications. But the collective West doesn't want to be involved at all into the information war against Russian Federation. And of course it is a huge issue for us, because in the 21st century, the toolkit is much wider than it used to be in the 20th one during the Cold War. If we speak directly about your issue and the formal, I am emphasizing this conventional or notional united narrative, besides the scarce resources, we need to speak about the main counter-narrative. The main counter-narrative for all of the audiences, starting with the Russian audience and ending with the global West, is the Russian narrative, that Russia is a peaceful country and it wants peace, and Ukraine is a puppet, vile country which is against the peace. This is the narrative which they developed since November, in October, November of 2023, and since then they're actively promoting it anywhere. And even Putin's statement before the Swiss summit, which we mentioned, to this or that extent, can be compliant with this formula. So we should think about the counter-narrative about that. And we should work, first of all, with the counter-narrative. And then, whether we have the help of the collective West, it will be much easier if we do. Yevhen? Let us try to transform our meeting into a poetic evening. If we have the problems with the narratives, we need to fight with creative approach. As the diplomatic relations with North Korea are over, why couldn't we, before the visit of Putin to North Korea, give to the World Food Organization 10,000 tons of wheat so as it could give to North Korea? Transfer it to North Korea. I'm just interested, why not do that? The enemy who doesn't have common borders with us. In this case, we would work to form the attitude of other countries of Global South. Obviously, we will not change the attitude of North Korea, how it looks like now. But it can be used as the information reason. Thank you so much for this conversation. If there are any questions left, let me know. If not, yes, please.
В Японии, ну, как вы все сказали, что
You all said that Russia may be present at the next summit. What would be the compulsory condition for the next summit? Yes, what will happen and what will be the necessary condition for the next summit? Microphone, please. If you may, could you say more details about your question? Could you clarify your question, please? What are you interested? What will take place?
how the next summit with Russia? I mean.
Is it possible to conduct the next summit without Russia? What do you think? We are speaking about the efficiency, not just about summit as it is. Is it possible to have summit without Russia? It is possible, but I doubt that it is needed. Do we need the next summit with Russia? It depends on Russia. If the wonder, the miracle happens, and the Russian Federation has internal changes within it, in the state or in the thinking of the leaders or just in the opinions of the dictator, and they suddenly will have a goodwill strike, then it will be possible. So far, there is not a single sign for the opportunity or probability of regulation of this war or settlement of this war through the goodwill. I don't see anything like that. Russian external foreign policy and strategic culture do not foresee the equal negotiations and talks with anybody. They can have concessions only when they see hopeless situation. That is proved by history. Any concessions are still considered to be temporary and forced. This is just the reason for the future revenge and the war. So strategic culture of Russia does not foresee equal negotiations. Moreover, with Ukraine, which is not considered to be a subject at all, it is considered to be a proxy force of the collective West or the United States. They are looking at Ukraine and they don't see Ukraine. They see the US. Ukraine, in this sense, is not visible at all. And in this sense, what Russia strives to get with this war, it doesn't want to have talks with Ukraine. For Russia, it is a technical issue. It would like to have talks with the US about the new order of the world, its own zone of impact, domination over its neighbors. This is the strategic interest of the Kremlin regime. So we can conduct many different summits and wonderful ideas, and they will be naively broken by Russian position and their strategic culture. The peace formula, which is mentioned by Ukraine, obviously will not be the one which Russia likes, but any other formula will not be liked by Ukraine. So until the world, the whole world, including the West, the South, the East, the North, until they perceive these peace probable, that it can be achieved through concessions to the aggressor, not through the punishment of the aggressor, the situation will be a dead-end situation. I thank you. I would like to express my gratitude for this conversation. It seems to me it turned out to be interesting and full of sense. Thank you for everybody who joined it, and I do hope that we all got a bit more understanding of the whole process, and we will notice its continuation. Thank you so much, and just now our team is preparing the schedule for tomorrow, so see you. Goodbye.